The engagement that Daniel and I did together for several years with one of the biggest companies in India, we had access to the top. And still, it was incredibly difficult to turn that organization to do anything significant in a short amount of time. The way that you get these organizations to change is you prove the model. In the same way that we run experiments to test product, we run experiments to test process and ways of working. So instead of saying, hey, on Monday, we're all using SAFe, disaster, right? Or whatever, replace SAFe with whatever, like doesn't matter. We're going to take 15 folks and you're going to give them to me for a quarter, uninterrupted, focused on an initiative that is strategically important, but not critical. In other words, people are going to pay attention to it, but if it goes sideways, no one's getting fired, right? We're going to put together a set of OKRs I'm going to work towards, and we're going to set them loose.
Welcome to the Product Agility Podcast, the missing link between Agile and product. The purpose of this podcast is to share practical tips, strategies, and stories from world-class thought leaders and practitioners. Why, I hear you ask? Well, I want to increase your knowledge and your motivation to experiment so that together we can create ever more successful products. My name is Ben Maynard, and I'm your host. What has driven me for the last decade to bridge the gap between agility and product is a deep-rooted belief that people and products evolving together can achieve mutual excellence.
Hello and welcome to the Product Agility Podcast. I am your host, still, Ben Maynard, and today I am honoured, humbled, nervous to be welcoming two people that I would say, at least in my eyes, are legends, people that I admire greatly, and I'm just so excited to have them both here. It seems like a strange dream to think that back in October or November, I met Dan Terhorst-North for the second time ever at a conference, and we were talking about many things. We released an episode after the conference, and it's kind of led to this today. So yes, it was a huge pleasure that we have Jeff Gothelf and Dan Terhorst-North joining us today for a very special episode. Jeff, Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Wow. And don't worry if we talk over each other, it will happen. Yeah. The joys of having three people on the podcast. We had an episode come out a few weeks back and there was four of us. Wow. And that was a nightmare to edit. Oh, God, that wasn't too bad. Anyway, so for those people out there that perhaps haven't heard of either of you, I mean, where the hell have you been, people? But for those people that haven't, I wonder, could we get a short introduction from you both? And perhaps we could start with Jeff.
Sure. Hey, folks, my name is Jeff Gothelf. I have had a career as a designer, a product manager, a team leader, an entrepreneur, an author, a consultant, a coach, keynote speaker. These days, I focus heavily on the practice of product management and product discovery and objectives and key results. I've co-authored a book called Lean UX with Josh Seiden and another book with Josh called Sense and Respond. And Josh and I are writing a third book together called Who Does What by How Much, which is about objectives and key results. And I tend to work with large organizations, primarily mid-sized large organizations, helping them put the customer first in all of their product practices and try to help them become sort of more nimble, more agile, more responsive to the realities of the world as they change quickly around them.
Brilliant. Jeff, thank you very much. And Dan?
I'm not going to be nearly that eloquent. That was
Thank
beautiful.
you for flagging that at the beginning.
Can I just copy that and just change the word product for software?
Yes.
Although I haven't, I complete a book.
Is it that easy, Dan? Is that all we have to do is replace product for software? And he would know.
Not quite. So I've been in the technology space, I guess, for 30 years. It kind of breaks into decades. So the first decade, programmer, writing software, various different companies, different roles. Beginning of the 2000s, joined ThoughtWorks, international software consultancy, as their first tech hire in the UK. So they opened a London office and there were a little handful of us. And we grew that to like 250 people over a bunch of years, which was really exciting. So I was a consultant there for, best part of a decade. And that's where things like behavior-driven development happened, continuous delivery. It was a very, very exciting time in terms of how work works, if you like, in the technology space. Left there at the end of 2009, and then went and worked in a trading firm where I discovered that I can still code, which was nice. So I was in there as a developer and then working with the CIO on helping him improve his organization. Very, very smart guy. Medium-sized trading shop, I guess, at 500 odd people. And it was all a little bit complicated in terms of how work worked. And we managed to simplify that over a bunch of time to the point where I kind of no longer had a job. So I left. And then for the last 12 years or so, I've been independent. So I go into, again, like Jeff, medium to large organizations and cause mischief. But I tend to cause it on the delivery side. So I'm looking at technology, I'm looking at ways of working, I'm looking at org structure, I'm looking at teams, looking at leadership, looking at connecting people across the organization into like practices or guilds or communities or whatever your favorite term is. And I had the absolute luxury, joy, pleasure of working with Jeff for a good couple of years relatively recently, where the way I like to think of it is he's the do the right thing and I'm the do the thing right. Yeah. And these days, you find me again just about to. I'm on the cusp of. So what I've been doing for the last 10 years or so, I'm in the very exciting process of turning that into a thing, if you like. So mostly to get what I do in your organization, you hire me, which doesn't really scale because there's one of me. So I've been trying to kind of articulate what it is I do and how that works, which is pretty much ready to go now. And then I'll be working with a very small number of like brilliant partner organizations where how I do things is a product. So I'm excited to be nearly launching that. So that brings you right up to date.
Thank you very much. So we had a conversation before we began and we spoke about where we can start this conversation. And as a jumping off point, when you're looking at operating a product business at scale, how do you do it in a way which allows you to compete with much smaller organizations? And I think that one of the interesting things you were saying, Dan, when we were warming up for this, is that when you are a large company, maybe for a long time, it's all about relative speed. For any company, it's about relative speed. You don't have to be the fastest. You just have to be faster than the competition. And when such large organizations have been disrupted by smaller people who can get to market much quicker, then all of a sudden that relative speed is much quicker than it ever was before. And how can large organizations then put themselves in a situation where they can actually compete with these much more nimble, smaller organizations? Dan and Jeff, I will throw it over to you as to decide where we begin.
So I'd like to start. There's a lovely quote, and I don't know who to attribute it to. Probably Einstein or Mark Twain or someone usually. But the idea that innovation or invention isn't about seeing new things. It's about seeing exactly the same thing that everyone else sees, but in a different way. And one of the epiphanies I had over, I don't know, a bunch of time is that it's not about big and small companies. Like the fact that small companies can go faster isn't because they're small. And the fact that big companies can't go fast isn't because they're big. It's that what tends to have happened, and this is, classic management theory over the last probably century or more, is that as you grow, as a company scales, it scales by specializing. So you have engineering, you have sales, you have marketing, you have, all of these things. And they all have leaders and they'll have hierarchies and they'll have reporting lines. And then you end up with incentives in each of those areas. So you have marketing has incentives and engineering has incentives. And what Ellie Goldratt was talking about in the 80s and then Don Reinertsen in the 90s with the goal and product development flow respectively is the idea that value creation happens across those organizations. Value creation is sales and marketing identify the demand, the need. Engineering or manufacturing or whatever builds the thing that meets that need, and there's all these feedback loops. And if you have that, then you have product development flow. But we don't structure organizations like that. So the slowness isn't a function of size, it's a function of being the wrong shape. And effectively, if you can make an organization the same shape as a small startup, but you can have a bunch of those operating, quasi-independently, then guess what? They can go as fast as a startup and they have the benefit of this brilliant hive mind, right? So that means that large organizations should be able to innovate faster than any of its competitors because it has this enormous institutional learning and this enormous wealth. The problem that most organizations have is they have no way to store that. If they can store it, they have no way to tap into that. They have no way to do any of this in a timely way. And they blame that on size rather than structure or habits. So that's my pitch.
Thank you, Dan. So, Jeff, thinking about that, I mean, if you two sides of the same coin here, and Dan's looking at the organization and the engineering and that creation element here, and Jeff, you're bringing that product lens. Like, what do you think of what Dan said? Does that ring true? Is there more that needs to be added?
So I was going to talk about learning as well. I think that that's part of the reason, right? So an organization that is big is successful, and that with that success comes confidence, maybe perhaps a bit of arrogance, but certainly a sense of we know what the market wants. We know how to keep this machine moving forward. When you build learning into the process, as Daniel was referencing, it challenges the hierarchy. It challenges that confidence. It challenges that arrogance, because all of a sudden you might learn things that conflict with the prescribed direction or with the general sort of beliefs of the organization. And what that forces is a reckoning with reality, which a lot of organizations, they don't deal with that particularly well, because it means that somebody, and typically it's somebody with some kind of power or authority, has to stand up in front of people that work for them and say, I was wrong. Right? They have to admit that I had this idea about going this way. It turns out we've built this learning engine into our work. We've figured out how to operationalize it, how to share it, how to store it, etc. And what we're learning is that the direction that we've chosen, and by we, it's ultimately I have pushed us in, right, is no longer the right direction. And we need to change course. That happens so rarely. This idea that we can change direction significantly, right? Like varying, like, oh, we're going to make it red, we're going to make it blue, we're going to move the button 3 pixels to the left or right. That stuff still happens. But the more sort of fundamental decisions, we should not build this, right? Or this isn't going to deliver the expected return on investment or the value. Those conversations are still so rare. One of my biggest clients right now is a multinational financial services organization. They're all over the world, you know them. And I've been working with them for a couple of years. I've probably met 1,000 product managers, at least, in those 2 years. Every single one of them. How do you decide what to work on? Someone tells me. What happens if you decide it's not a good idea? Well, we ship it, and then we see what happens. Okay, and if it's a bad idea, after you've shipped it, like, what do you do with it? Nothing. We just keep working on the next thing, right? To me, this is where that time to market breaks down. This is where that organizational agility breaks down. Everything works on these, at very least, these annual cycles, and this unwillingness to break that cycle and to humbly admit that, you know what, this wasn't the best idea. And so before we go pouring another 9 months into it, let's pivot, let's change course, let's do something else. It's so rare, and that hinders these organizations. It's incredible how much production is incentivized and how risky it is, at least perceived, to be wrong about your organizational predictions.
Can I offer a couple of examples came to mind as you were sort of talking there, Jeff. One of failure and one of success, both from back in the day. So IBM was one of the great technology innovators of the 60s and 70s. They came up with one of the first databases. It was a hierarchical database called DB1. And the idea was that you would model your world as a hierarchy, because we just think of the world as hierarchies, and your products and your whatever it was, your business processes, and you would put them in DB1 and it would store all your data. And one of their research fellows, so like one of the most senior people in IBM at the time, a guy called Edgar Codd, came up with a different way of storing data, which we now call the relational database. He said, what if things aren't hierarchical? What if things can relate to each other and back and forward, and they can be connected, and it's not quite what we thought? And they built a database model based on Ted Codd's ideas at IBM, and they called it DB2, obviously, because it's the successor to DB1. And then IBM promptly sat on it. And they said, what are you doing? They said, well, clearly, if we ship this and it is amazing, it's going to cannibalize all our DB1 sales. And that's a different line of business. So it's a different, VP of DB1 who's going to be very unhappy. The VP of DB2 is stealing all their sales. So one of the lead engineers on DB2 rage quit. His name's Larry Ellison. He then went off and set up a competing organization, which you will know as Oracle, which took the relational database idea and turned it into a product, got it to market before IBM decided to release DB2, and did okay. Right? So Oracle only exists because IBM's executives couldn't see that the market was data not DB1 versus DB2.
Oh, interesting.
That's my counter example. My success example is, and I love Andy Grove because he's also the progenitor of OKRs and a load of other really cool ideas, is the story of him and his, I think, CTO at the time, sacking themselves. So Intel was a memory company. They were a very successful memory company. And they could see that the market in memory chips was diminishing. They were still leading the market, but they could see the market was going to diminish based on competition. But they and their executives are all doubling down on memory. And they said, and he had a meeting in his boardroom, and he said, right, if this wasn't our company, say you and I came in and you just inherited this company right now, none of the history, nothing at all, just what you can see in the market, what would you do? He said, well, I'd move to CPUs. So CPUs are the future. Memory is going to become a commodity. CPU is the differentiator. And so Andy Grove said, right, I'm going to sack both of us. So he sacked both of them. They left the room, came back in, said, right, we're going to pivot. We're going to become a CPU company. And that decision, they, in their incumbent form, they knew they couldn't make. Right, imagine this is a new company. Imagine we've just been parachuted in as the CXOs of this failing memory company. What would you do? And that gave them the kind of the free headspace to say, we just need to, it's, there's a massive sunk cost and massive, retooling and whatever else. It's still the right thing to do. And became, the most successful CPU company in the world.
The brilliant story. A few thoughts popped to my head.
Bill.
Have you ever seen the BBC documentary, The Shuttle That Fell to Earth? Have you seen this? It's about the Columbia disaster.
No.
And it was really thinking about, Jeff, what you were saying, because in the documentary they interview people, and obviously with Columbia, it was a tragic story, but when it took off, it lost a plate, basically some shielding, which meant that when it came back into Earth, it wasn't going to survive. And all the analysts on the ground who could see this, who were charged with understanding just what's the likelihood of X and Y happening and what are the different scenarios, they said, we need them to look out the window. If they look out the window, they can tell us what's missing, and we might be able to come up with something. And the bosses were like, no, we can't tell them. They can't look out the window and have a look at it. And they're like, but we're literally running simulations and coming up with hypotheses, and we might be able to save this if they just looked out the window. Nope. And then when they're interviewing the one particular analyst, they're like, why didn't you just talk to the big boss? Why didn't you go? So that isn't how NASA worked.
Wow.
It has to get a chain of command. And I tried to speak out, and then I was reprimanded. And I've got a mortgage. I've got kids.
Yeah.
I couldn't lose my job.
Yeah.
And so that was people's lives. And so what I wonder is, I can't disagree with everything you were both saying around what these big organizations can do, but it's really hard because of the humans involved and some of the hierarchies there, and they exist. And so what I'm wondering is, given your collective experience, what are some of the most impactful interventions you can make in those contexts to actually begin to kind of turn things around?
It's I feel like I've been saying this for 1,000 years. The easy,
you look good on it, Jeff.
Yeah. It's interesting. The most powerful thing that you can do to start to change the mindset is put these decision makers, these sort of infallible, high-ranking decision makers, in front of customers. Just have them observe customers, watch a video, do a conversation, talk to them. It's incredibly powerful to see what people actually do with the products that you deemed absolutely necessary. And sometimes it's nothing, right? But to get that actual feedback, because it's one thing if a middle manager says, hey, boss, this was a bad idea. But it's another if the people that you're actually selling to repeatedly saying, I don't use this, I can't figure it out, I don't know what this is for, why would I pay for this, right? All of these types of questions. There's absolutely nothing more powerful than that. I'll tell you an interesting story. Years ago, I worked at a company called The Ladders. The Ladders was a job board. It connected people who were looking for jobs that paid more than $100,000 with employers looking to hire them. Basically, kind of an executive search version of a job board. And what they found out was that the richer the job description, in other words, the more words there were in a job description, the more likely it was to get applications, people applying for that particular position. And it's a dating site, basically. You've got to connect these folks together, right? And so one thing that the boss decided to do, the boss, CEO, founder type of individual, he would routinely kind of come down from his office to our production floor and say, with these epiphanous shower moments, and be like, oh, I know what we have to do today. Everybody turned left, right? And so one day he's like, look, more robust job descriptions. We have to put a minimum character count on the job description. Okay. We implemented the minimum character count, and then we went looking to see what was happening. And the change wasn't having the impact on behavior that we were looking for. And so we had to figure out why. And we went and we talked to some folks. And it turns out that for a lot, not the majority, but for a lot of our jobs, especially because they were senior positions, the positions were niche enough and specific enough to where you could get the point across fairly quickly. You didn't need to write 7 paragraphs of text to describe the position. And what people were doing, and this is incredible, we had a rich text editor on the website. What people were literally doing was they would put in the required information about the job, but then they still have some characters they'd have to fill in because the submit button wouldn't turn on until the character count, the minimum character count was hit. They would type in white text on a white background, just nonsense, to hit the character count so that they could submit the job request, right? And there wasn't one person or 2 or 3, there were dozens of people doing this. And simply talking to these folks and filming these short 90-second video clips and then just putting them up on a screen in front of the CEO, it's like, look, we can't continue to work this way. Like, you just making us build stuff for no reason. Let's at least figure out what's driving some of this before we start throwing features up there, right? And to me, that's how you get folks to start to pay attention. It's the only way, is to say, look, the customers say X, right? Everything else is out the window. The customers say X. I'll tell you another really quick and really sad story to illustrate this point. I did work years ago with one of these the bank. Let's just call it a bank in the United States. And I was working with the Android app team. They were building the app, and whoever was running that business unit was super unhappy with it. And he kept coming back. He's like, well, I saw this on an app that my kids were using, so I want you to add this to the mobile banking app. And I saw this on another app that I'm using. I want you to add this to the mobile banking app. And no matter how much they pushed back or showed him research or whatever it is, it didn't work. And the only thing that this executive actually paid attention to was reviews in the App Store. And so what the team did, and this is kind of brilliant and sad at the same time, is they went and they put fake reviews in the App Store that were based on real data that they'd collected doing research and talking to customers, knowing full well that the boss would read it and then be like, oh, people don't want this. I have to change my mind. So whatever it takes to get customer opinion in front of leaders, to me, that starts to shift the mindset.
Thank you, Jeff. And Dan, what's your most impactful intervention? What can you think of?
So this is something I do very deliberately quite a lot. Is a lot of this is about identity. So it's how you define yourself. And if you define yourself as the person in charge of all these people, and actually you could be running a much leaner organization, but you like the idea of having a huge fiefdom, a huge kingdom, then you're not really going to be open to that very much. So 2 things. One is understanding motivation, right? What's in it for them? Why are they doing this? And another part I've found very effective is if you help someone realign their identity, if you like, their definition of good, their definition of success. So, in an organization, and the classic one, the one that I come to again and again and again, is utilization versus outcomes, right? Or Jeff's, outcomes over outputs. So, a depressingly large proportion of senior execs in large organizations, we're hiring these expensive people. We want to keep them busy, right? I want to look at, activity. I want to see that, if Ben is spending any time, toilet breaks, let's do those in your own time, right? Let's think about how to keep my people as busy as I can, because that maximizes my return on investment. I want to sweat my assets. And just the red pill moment, if you like, of when you explain flow and you explain throughput and you explain that, time to value, and that in order to optimize these things, you need to look at the same organization through a different lens. Don't look at how busy the workers are. Look at how the work items are moving through the organization and where they're getting stuck and why they're getting stuck and what we can change in the organization to unstick them. And you see that, and it is an epiphany. It is a sudden realization moment. And I remember this with one exec at a big bank, because Jeff and I tend to work in big banks. And this was a
capital B.
three. Pardon?
Capital B.
Oh, yeah. This was probably one of the most capital Bs you can get. And they had in there what they call securities operations. And securities is anything non-physical in a bank that trades. So this is, stock, shares, options, futures, bonds, all the stuff, all the contracts, anything that's basically not, pork bellies or orange juice or whatever is called securities. And securities operations is all of the unsexy stuff that happens when you're done trading. So it's taking all of the trades and all the counterparties and making sure it adds up to zero. And it never adds up to zero, right? And netting. So if I've done 300 trades with Jeff and he's done 300 trades with you, and we can figure out that actually I just need to write you a check, Ben, and we're all square. So that kind of work, and tax, right? It's really dull things, but necessary things. That work they had 3,000 people doing that in this huge bank. And the exec that hired me into there, he said, the reason I wanted to work with him, he said this lovely thing when I first met him. He said, I'm looking after a 3,000 person operation in this bank. And I'm usually the next thing they say is next year it's going to be 5,000. He didn't. He said, Dan, I'm embarrassed about that. He said, this is not a 3,000 person problem. It's probably a 300 person problem.
Yeah.
But we made it a 3,000 person problem. I'm trying to figure out how to, what do we do? And they'd had all the, the big methodologists and the big frameworks and blah. I'm usually people's last attempt. Last time we've tried, everyone else will try that Daniel guy. And I showed him his organization. I showed him where stuff was getting blocked. And within a year, we doubled throughput, like doubled the amount of business change that was happening in a year, halved lead time. So anything that came into the department got done in half the time in less than a year. Same people, same tech. It wasn't a complete rewrite of all the technology stack. You name any technology in the last 40 years, and the answer is yes. They are very, very complicated and very, very legacy estate. And still, in the context of that, we doubled throughput, halved lead time. The following year, because now folks were getting the hang of it, we did it again. So now you had 4 times the throughput. Anything was taking a quarter of the time it did 2 years ago. And it was just by changing how they looked at work and how they thought about work. And the great thing when you do this is you get this sort of win-win-win, because guess what? People aren't 100% utilized. They're going home on time. They're seeing their kids. They're getting a good night's sleep. They come bouncing into the office because they know that the work they do is going to have impact really soon instead of sitting there for 2 years not being released. And all of this started with a reframing with the senior folks saying, this is what your organization actually does. And this is what success should look like. And when they have that kind of, that really is like an aha moment, then they're like, okay, well, how do we get there? I'm not an idiot. I'm happy to spend money on this. I've been trying to do this other thing and I'm very, very good at this for a long time. And clearly it isn't working. So now let's try the other thing and see if we can make that work. And when they do, and it suddenly starts working. And again, the great thing is they're not doing the stuff. I wasn't doing the stuff. You had these 450, I think, engineers in a 3,000 person division doing all the computering things. And they were doing all the stuff. We said to them, right, we need to focus on lead time, throughput, work in process. And they were like, what do those things even mean? I go, great, good question. Let's start there. Right. And so it was a bunch of education. But by and large, each team figured stuff out for themselves because they're smart people close to their own work, and they're adults, and we treat them like adults. And that's kind of been my template for the last decade or so, is you go in and you say, let's take a look at your organization. Let's take a look at how work works, right? Let's take a look at what success actually means. And let's start reframing some of that. And then what I love is there's an inflection point where instead of trying to push on the organization to change, you're trying to manage the demand, like manage the floodgates of people saying, hey, that's looking really successful over in Ben's department. What are they doing? Can we get some of that over here?
Yeah.
And that's a really exciting time.
I want to riff on something you said really quickly. Just as I picked up on it. You said they always bring you in last, right? That's the role I play as well. It's super interesting, right? Because look, we are individual practitioners. Sometimes when we work together as a team, it's 2, 3, 4 people. It's not 50 or 500 or 1,000 people that are coming in to change this. This idea that nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM, and these days it's fill in McKinsey or BCG or Deloitte or whatever. Is super interesting because that mentality persists, right? The only people who can help us are McKinsey, right? Or whatever it is. And then it never works, right? It never actually makes things better, right? All the PowerPoint decks and whatever doesn't actually make things better. And then we come in and have to clean that mess up. And and that's a big mess because we're small practitioners, And I think it's interesting to talk about that. Why aren't we in first, right, or second for that matter? And I think I know the answer, but it's interesting to hear you say it because it's exactly the position. We tried this product management and discovery.
They're still there, right? We tried these people; they're still here.
Yeah.
And the call is coming from inside the house.
Right. Exactly. It's look, I'm glad they're calling, but it's frustrating to have to come in and put out fires. Like I'd love to come in and be like, this is what we can do. And what's fascinating, just a quick story related to this, I was working with a big telco in Germany, right? B capital T. And I got to present to the C-suite, which is great. And I'm speaking to the C-suite. And then after a big presentation about managing the outcomes and customer centricity, I have a meeting with the number 3 guy at the company. And we're talking about building cross-functional teams. Now, this company has the entirety of the IT department. I already said IT department, so you already know what's coming, right? It's insourced, but it's a separate entity that sits somewhere else, and it's basically treated as a third-party vendor. And they said, well, what do we need to do to make this stuff that you just talked about a reality? And I said, you got to build cross-functional teams, product, design, engineering, working together on the same things at the same time.
In fact, sleeping together.
Yeah, exactly. It's anarchy, right? And so it's the number 3 guy and his 2 lieutenants and me in this meeting, and his 2 lieutenants look at him, and they go, "Impossible! It's never going to happen." And he looks at them and he goes, "If not us, the 3 of us. I'm the number 3 guy in the company, right? If not us, then who? Who's going to be able to make this change?" And it's interesting to think that, right? Like it was a great epiphany on his part. And it's not bringing in McKinsey that's going to make this change. And it's not bringing us in that's actually going to make this change ultimately, right? It's folks like that deciding that this is what they want to do and then finding the best people to help guide them along the path, which ideally is us. But it's so interesting that there's this mentality that nothing can be different. And the only way that we could potentially make it different is to bring in these high-powered, high-cost consulting companies that end up just making a mess of things. It's frustrating. Just venting a little bit.
Vent away. I mean, I wonder how much of it is to do with things like ego or not wanting to be shown as, I don't know, responsible or accountable for something that you can't do. I think it takes a lot for someone to turn around and say, like, I can't do this, but let me find someone I can work with who can help us achieve this, rather than saying, I'm just going to spend my money and let that thing over there sort it out. I mean, a la SAFE to an extent. I think that sometimes I look at SAFE and I just think this is a nice like organizations need some kind of operating model, implicit or explicit, but need something that ties strategy to execution and ops. And there's something there. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implicit. It just evolves and grows, but there's something there. And I think in my time at Deutsche Bank, I only spent 3 or 4 years there as a director. And, when people looked at SAFE, they say, well, that just means I can just basically take that operating model effectively and magically everything will work. I don't have to think. If it goes wrong, I can blame that.
Yeah.
But then we were very clear that when we started making our own operating model based upon other various principles and ideas, but not SAFE, we said, let's not use the name of whatever we use, because the moment things get a bit bumpy, and they will get bumpy, people will point their finger at the thing we've chosen and say, that's broken, that will never work. And that probably isn't the case. The problem is actually it's we're learning how to operate in this new environment rather than it being that point the finger at thing, and we'll take responsibility for that. And I think there is an element here of maybe, people wanting to outsource the responsibility and be able to point the finger at something other than themselves. And it takes a certain type of leader to have the humility and the courage to say, if not us, then who?
Yeah.
That just struck a whole load of thoughts with me. I think something you said there, Ben, I want to pick up on is this idea of this operating model and it failing. And what I've found, and again, this is more, it's kind of emerged over the years of doing this, is I'll try things. I'll try things like modeling the value streams in the organization. I'll try things like getting the various people, and often, quite political operators, in the same room as each other. And what I've realized is I'm not expecting it to succeed, right? I'm expecting it to break in an unexpected way. So in other words, the way in which it breaks is signal, right? If these people refuse to even come in the room, that's signal. If they come in the room, but they're clearly talking across each other, that's signal. If they come in the room, they all get on brilliantly and they wish they'd done this 2 years ago, that's signal. So you don't know what's going to happen. And this is why, rigid frameworks that have, cutesy roles and structures and blah and training, not naming any names, but, certification Ponzi schemes, I tend to be a little bit cool on, because, Jerry Weinberg used to call it solutioneering, where you have this model and you go, right, okay, so the problem you have is that you don't have SAFe, you don't have less, you don't have Scrum at scale. And then so you go, right, you've got this problem, you now implement SAFe, now you've got 2 problems, right?
Yeah.
And because no one ever said, what's the goal? What's the need you're trying to meet as an organization? Faster to market, less cost, improved quality, whatever the thing is, right? Our customers are leaving us in droves because Apple just opened a bank. What are we trying to respond to? And let's start there. Let's start with the goal and work backwards. And that's kind of the thing I'm baking at the moment. I did want to share with you. So Ellie Goldrat's The Goal, this lovely book from 1984, and still very relevant today. It's a business novel about this guy Alex who runs a factory, and they're going to close the factory down in like 30 days. It's just all going horribly wrong. And so he's, and he's going to lose his job, and his marriage is on the rocks, and it's all going wrong for Alex. And then he meets an old school teacher, and the school teacher starts basically asking him a bunch of Socratic questions that lead to a load of enlightenment. And it turns out that everything's okay. Very, for me, life-changing book. You really do kind of, what I love with Socratic questions. So Socratic question is a question that leads you to some kind of discovery, some kind of enlightenment. Is you're reading the book and you get the answer just before Alex does. You're reading and you turn the page and you go, yeah. Or sometimes you don't. Sometimes you turn the page and you go, wait, what? And then you've just had that moment, right? So it's very effective. But that's not what I want to mention. The thing I want to mention is at the end of more recent versions is an extended interview with Ellie Goldrat. And that interview is worth the entrance fee alone, right? Forget the book, just read the interview. And there's this wonderful bit in it where he asks exactly this question. He says, so Mr. Goldrat, clearly the thing you're talking about, Mr. Gothelf, clearly the thing you're doing is product management. It works, right? How long does it take typically, a typical engagement? And he answers, he says, well, a typical engagement, he says, between 5 and 15 years. And they're like, what? How come? He says, oh, it's very simple. He says, I am offering a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift is not, now available in blue. We're going to move the button to the right. Your paradigm is the way you see the world. A paradigm shift is breaking that model and seeing the world differently. The shift from activity-based measurements to flow-based measurements is a paradigm shift. The shift from our product has features to our product meets customer needs is a paradigm shift. And you cannot hold both those thoughts in your head at the same time. One of them has to break. And it turns out that as human beings, the one thing we hate is having our paradigm shifted, right? Because, it's our sanity. It's how we make sense of the world. And he says, so basically you need 3 things to shift a paradigm. The first thing you need is to have run out of options. You've tried everything else. You're desperate. The second thing you need is an existential crisis, right? If we do not do this thing, we go out of business. The third thing you need is information that this new thing exists. He says, I'm good for number 3. So what I do is I make friends with organizations and I wait for 1 and 2. And eventually the phone rings and I say, hey, Mr. Goldrat, we're having an existential crisis. Mr. Gothelf, we're having an existential crisis. We've tried everyone else. You're the last name on the list. Can you help us? And he says the more enlightened organizations, they will force an existential crisis. We have to do this thing. They will force no other options by saying, we're going to try Jeff's thing. And when you get that number 3 exec in a room saying, if not us, who? Right? That is, you just grin, right? That is the once in a decade meeting you were in where you're like, oh my goodness. You just take me 2 years of nudging and nudging and nudging on your organization until someone finally says what you just said.
Yeah.
Right? And it is, honestly, it is delightful and very rare when that happens.
Yeah.
There's a great book, I don't know if you guys have had this book here.
I don't know that one.
Design for How People Learn by Julie Dirksen.
Okay.
Julie's a marvel. She's one of the most amazing people I've ever met. And this book and her new book as well about behavioral science and learning is fantastic. But in this book, she talks about gaps and the gaps that we need to fill and basically to get change at an individual level or even organizational level. And my favorite ones are skills, knowledge, and motivation. And I think part of the issue is in large organizations, when that crisis isn't there, when the motivation isn't there, people think that we can change the shape, our paradigm by education. And we teach people and things will happen. They're not realizing actually that if people need to be proficient in the thing, and it takes more than just being told what it is, it takes practice. And so they hire coaches in and they try and get a bit of practice. But the biggest gap, it isn't the knowledge and it isn't the skills, it's the motivation. And so whenever I think of engaging with clients or whenever I think of training, is particularly, I say, I'm there to fill some knowledge gaps. And I think, Dan, this is probably what you get with the stuff that you're doing, is that you motivate people. Yeah, you give them some information and then they've got something they can go away and try and put into practice. But it's how do we motivate people to then want to go ahead and make that change? And I think the challenge, I guess, that people are experiencing, if we go back to the top question that we had, is that we have these large organizations which maybe have many, many products within it. And we may have these kind of vertical products. We can get each one aligned and doing something which is deemed as better in their opinion. But then at that whole organization level, how do we create motivation for the organization to change the paradigm rather than just slices through it?
Two very quick responses to that. One is the fairly recent observation that you act your way to a new way of thinking. You know, the way you get the paradigm shift is you don't come in and go, hey, everyone, we're going to shift our paradigm. So, right, I just want you to try this thing. And we did this at John Lewis. And that was challenged a few years ago and said, right, you've been running for 100 and something years. Surely you should be like a shareholder, blah. And they managed to defeat it. And they said, no, we're going to carry on being a partnership. Really interesting organization, culturally just very nice, right? Everyone there, some of the just most genuinely lovely people I've worked with. And they have an online function. And the online function it's the website, it's the mobile apps, it's everything that you would do. Certainly pre-pandemic, this is like 20 teens, I think something like 40% of their revenue was coming through the website. Now, this is an organization with 60,000 partners, I think it is, across like Waitrose and John Lewis, all the stores. Something like 3,000 of those in their head office, 1,000 of those in technology, people propping up the entire web estate. And my gig, if you like, was how do we get them all pointing in the same direction? They'd scaled really well, but they were now like, there was a fragmentation going on. And we did some great work there about getting them pointed in the same way.
But we were talking about that broader organizational purpose, right? That motivation. We can motivate the pieces of an organization. How do you motivate the whole?
So we had, I think it was a dozen teams at that point, and they were all operating fairly independently. And Daniel comes in, and of course, a dozen teams are now going, oh no, this guy's going to come and tell us to do Scrum or Kanban or something, or he's going to come and tell us how to work. And what I did is I said to them, look, go nuts, do what you like, work how you want to work. Like, you hear all these people going, I said, I need 3 numbers from you every 2 weeks. I need to know throughput. How much work has come into your team that you've shipped? I need to know lead time. How old is each thing you ship? When you ship a thing, did it come in 14 months ago? Did it come in 14 days ago? And the third number I need is how much stuff are you working on right now? That's called your work in process. So I need those 3 numbers. Do what you like, as long as every 2 weeks on a 2-week cadence, all of you can give me those numbers. And some of the teams couldn't. And so we helped them. And so we showed them how to. And within a fairly short period of time, we had all of these teams working on a cadence. We now had a program view of what was going on, which meant that we could start to think about alignment. The next stage then was, guess what? OKRs, right? Objectives and key results. How do we give all of them a shared sense of direction? Because if you give people a shared sense of direction and a lot of autonomy, motivation kind of takes care of itself, right? An awful lot of people come into work and they don't know the why. They know the what, right? They've got a manager or someone telling them the what. They don't know the why. And it's really hard to motivate yourself when you don't know the why.
Yeah.
So So the big part really is can we get people with a shared sense of purpose, shared sense of direction? And where you have these, 14 different products or whatever it was, and 14 different people saying, well, 14 sets of OKRs, those aren't OKRs. Those are near-term objectives from a bunch of 14 tactical products. OKRs is what objective, as a company, if we were going to say, what do we want to be different in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now? What headline thing do we want our customers saying about us that's different? That's exciting? Wow, you've become loads more reliable. Wow, your products have become a lot more consistent with each other. It looked like you just, bought a load of products and your current offering is a bunch of products and a trench coat. It's really obvious that now I feel like I'm using a suite of products from the same vendor. Reliability, man, it all used to be buggy as hell, but I'll tell you what, it hasn't crashed in ages. And I just want you to know, I appreciate that. I don't know what the thing is, right? Jeff doesn't know what the thing is. He's really, really good at asking what the thing is, right? And teasing at it until they find out, because often they don't know what the thing is. They haven't articulated it. And once you can tell when they hit the thing, because when someone mentions the thing, everyone else in the room goes, oh yeah. It's not like oh wow. It's like, yeah, I guess that's probably the thing. And as soon as you get a bunch of people around the table going, yeah, that's probably the thing, write it down, because that's the thing.
Yep.
And what we do, and again, Jeff and I think our work is very complementary. A lot of people see OKRs in terms of business goals, business outcomes. And I see them as broader than that. They're success outcomes. So you might have an objective about the product, about the market, about customers. You might also have objectives about the operating model. We had an objective, we set an explicit goal at the big bank: halve lead time, double throughput with no loss of quality. We're not allowed to do it by cutting corners, right? Brilliant, hairy, audacious goal. And what I loved is it's called a managing director, a senior guy at a bank. He said to me afterwards, he said, I don't care what the results are. He said, some of my teams are going to find it trivially easy to halve their lead time and double their throughput. They own their entire stack. Some of these teams are going to find it impossible because all of their work is basically coordinating other people's work. He says, I don't care what the results are. What I care about is that now 450 engineers are all asking themselves, what the heck is lead time and what the heck is throughput? Because that means we're all facing the same way. And that to me, I was like, right, you're going to win. You're going to win at this.
What can you add to that?
Look, the organizations that Daniel and I work with are massive. They're always big. And I think you have to take wins as they come and use those wins to drive more wins. I know that sounds a little cliche, but that's the way it works. I think even if we come in and look, the engagement that Daniel and I did together for several years with one of the biggest companies in India, we had access to the top. We did. And still, it was incredibly difficult to turn that organization to do anything significant in a short amount of time. The way that this works, in my experience at least, the way that you get these organizations to change is you prove the model. In the same way that we run experiments to test product, we run experiments to test process and ways of working, right? So instead of saying, hey, on Monday, we're all using SAFe, disaster, right? Or whatever, replace SAFe with whatever. Doesn't matter. OKRs, Scrum, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? We're going to say, look, we're going to take, what do we have? We have 1,500 folks in product development. All right, we're going to take 15 folks. And you're going to give them to me for a quarter, uninterrupted, right? Focused on an initiative that is strategically important, but not critical. In other words, people are going to pay attention to it. But if it goes sideways, no one's getting fired, right? We're going to put together a set of OKRs I'm going to work towards, and we're going to set them loose. And they're going to figure out how to build a way of working that is outcome-focused, customer-centric, has continuous learning and improvement built into it, self-sufficient, empowered, all of the things that we've talked about forever. And we are going to measure not only their progress towards their OKRs, but we're going to measure their work, their productivity, their camaraderie, their efficiency, et cetera. And we're going to make this obvious to the organization. It's going to be transparent. It's going to be continuously shared out so that at the end of this experiment. It's a time box, right? And let's just say it's a quarter, ideally, right? 12 weeks. At the end of this time box, if we've been successful, it's not just a big reveal. Ta-da! We're awesome now. You've seen the transformations, the good parts, the bad parts, the hard parts, the pivots, etc. And now that we've come to the end of this particular experiment, we've got the evidence that says this is better. And we've learned a bit about how to do better here. So now let's take 2 more teams. Now we've got 3 teams. Right? We go from 3 to 5, from 5 to 10, from 10 to 25, whatever. Right? But that's it. You de-risk the change by proving the model and then using evidence to drive further investment in the change. That's it. And it's not rocket science, and it's still rare. There's still this like, let's just give it to everybody all at once, and we know what happens. Yeah. That's what I've seen work.
And this, yeah. I'd love to maybe meet up, I don't know, and talk about this in person, or even do another episode at some point, because it's just that inclination to try and do it all at once, or to try and get that big payoff, rather than going slowly. And I know that I've experienced situations where I know why that happens, but I don't know if that differs from what you've all experienced. But it's definitely a problem. I think there is little desire to go slow and learn and experiment.
Well, and to Jeff's point, I mean, my big American bank story, when this chap stood on a chair in front of 400 odd people and said half lead time, double throughput, was a good year into the engagement. I had been working with him with some of his teams, and I tend to go a little bit bigger than Jeff. I'll be like a program team, maybe 50 people. Mm-hmm. But if you think that those things are probably correlated, because around a 15-person product team is probably a 50-person program team. It's a similar sort of size. Mm-hmm. So big enough that if we are measurably successful in a quarter, it's because of what we did, right? For me, it needs to be critical enough work that, as Jeff says, you've got their attention. If it doesn't matter, no one cares. No one cares how you got there. No one cares if you're great at it. It needs to be, probably not people being fired, but certainly people being embarrassed, right? Mm. I've got your attention. You've just given me something that is really important to you, that it's an act of trust. You trust that we're going to do this thing in a way that you wouldn't have done before. And again, it goes back to Ellie Goldrat's paradigm shift thing, is the reason you've asked me to do this is probably because you tried all the other things, right? We're now going to try Jeff's crazy sense and respond thing because all that other stuff that we got from, Accenture or whatever isn't working for us. So, it is an important thing. I do need it to get to market. There is an urgency about it. Right, Jeff, please do something in the next quarter. And he's like, right, roll up the sleeves, see what I can do. So I do absolutely agree with starting big enough that you're going to make a splash, but small enough that you're not trying to turn the whole ship. And prove it and prove it and prove it again. And I think to Jeff's comment about, proving the model, there's something, a chap called Chris Matz, who's a lovely kind of product business analyst guy I go back a long way with. He talks about breaking the model. So, introduce a constraint that the current system simply could not meet, right? And that we could. I know at Deutsche, there was the brilliant Paul Shepard. The constraint was idea to production safely in a day. Can I get a small change, but an actual customer, business-facing change through all of the systems, all the governance, all the regulatory, which is the word safely? Can I get an idea safely to production in a day? And from a standing start, it was I'm probably not allowed to say, but it was certainly a significant number of weeks to take a small change to production. And that was where he started. And by the time he finished, but an entire kind of what they call a continuous compliance platform, you could indeed take a small but significant change to production safely in a day. And actually in half a day, you could start in the morning and have it out by lunchtime. So he exceeded his own goal. But he did this by breaking the system. We cannot do it in a day. Why not? Why not? And keep on asking why not, and worrying at that and fixing that thing. Just next constraint until the answer is, well, we can. We can't get a product out in a quarter. Well, why not? Right? Let's get Jeff on it until we can. Right? And suddenly, 2 or 3 quarters in, we're taking. And again, it's this wonderful reinforcing loop. The business folks, the commercial folks, are no longer trying to put huge amounts of stuff on you, because they know that when they ask you something, you will turn it around inside a quarter. They've never had that before. And you'll turn it around in a quarter in a way that can be measured right? And they can measure the impact of this thing. And so now guess what? They start to get an appetite for trying lots of smaller things much more frequently. And now you're not doing it every quarter, you're doing it every couple of weeks. And you create this reinforcing kind of virtuous cycle of lots of small experiments going through, direct customer feedback, direct interaction, try the next thing. And when it takes root, it's wonderful. But it is just that initial paradigm shift, that initial, can we get this thing off the mark?
When you say that, what it reminds me of is a quote from Peter Senge from a long time ago, which is saying that if the answers to our problems are obvious, we'd already be doing them. So we have to accept that the answers to the problems are maybe some that, from your perspective, it's that they're non-obvious, and you haven't been able to find non-obvious things in the current ways you've been doing things. So we need to find a different, less obvious way of you doing things in order to kind of hit upon the things that are really going to break or put stress on the system so that it fractures, and you can begin to say, well, that's maybe where we need to focus.
Well, very importantly, it's not that the not obvious thing might not necessarily be hard. It's just different. No. It must be really complicated because we haven't figured it out yet. No, it's just different. It's really easy. It's different.
Yeah, through that current lens, you just won't see it. So it's giving you a different way of perceiving it. Awesome. Look, thank you so much for your time. I've kept you for a few minutes longer than we planned. So a huge thank you to you both for spending this time going through so much and looking through my notes that I've got here. I mean, we started off the idea of operating a product business at scale in a way that those compete with much smaller organizations. And we spoke about the shape of an organization. We spoke about learning, the importance of it. We spoke about identity change for an organization and for the leaders within it. About putting the decision makers in front of customers. And Jeff shared that wonderful story about minimum character count, which was just wonderful. There's so much more. So I'm hugely appreciative for you giving up your valuable time to have this conversation with me for the benefit of our listeners. I guess if people want to learn more about what you're up to at the moment, what's the best for you both? What's the best mechanisms? Where should they be going? Is it your website? Is it LinkedIn? Where can they find the most relevant information for you both?
I'm super easily findable, jeffgothelf.com, and on LinkedIn, please connect on LinkedIn, and okr-book.com will tell you everything you need to know about the new OKR book coming out in a month.
Great. We'll get that into the show notes for you.
Likewise, dannorth.net. As I said, I will be launching a new thing fairly soon, in weeks rather than months. I'll be very public about that. Mostly in terms of interaction, I'm on LinkedIn a lot these days. It seems to be it's become a less toxic version of. I'm no longer on the Twitters at all. I'm on Mastodon as Tastapod, but mostly in terms of kind of grown-up interactions and things, it tends to be LinkedIn.
Great. Well, we'll make sure all the links are in the show notes. And thanks again for your time. I massively appreciate it. And thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back again next week with who I don't quite know at the moment. But please do make sure you subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice. And we shall hear from you again soon. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.